the most brutal sports in history. There's really nothing like whacking a ball or two around with the bros, so much so that history has no shortage of sports in which you can do just that. But if you've ever wanted to have your frontal lobe caved in with a solid rubber ball, then look no further than the ancient Mesoamerican sport of uyamalitsli, the oldest known sport in history that revolved around using a ball. Now, for you 90s kids like myself, images of the Mesoamerican ball game may throttle your thinker with fleeting images of the classic DreamWorks animated film The Road to El Dorado, which features a whole scene focused on the sport. The problem is there are a few inaccuracies with how it was portrayed, but all's forgiven since the bulk of the budget was put towards hips rather than history. Now, before someone slaps their Dorito powdered mitts on their keyboard with a comment correcting me for using the term ancient to describe the sport, it is ancient. Now sure, the Mexica or Aztec were still playing ball even after the Spanish showed them the conquistador in the early 1500s, but the earliest known evidence of uyamalitsli actually dates all the way back to the Olmec around 1650 BC. So yeah, pretty friggin' ancient. As far as the Olmec go, however, the only thing we really know is that they invented and played the game. Unfortunately, there's really no surviving historical evidence of any rules or anything. What we do know is that the game was played under the same basic premise as any future iterations as far as using these same rubber balls and courts, but beyond that, nothing. Jumping through the following 2,000 years or so, the game evolved across the many different Mesoamerican civilizations who were better record keepers, but the general idea was more or less the same. Ball, court, walls, and hoops. Now, if one looks at the historical portrayals of the sport, you'd immediately assume that the goal of the game was to get the ball through the hoop. And you'd be wrong. Kinda. And I'll get to that in a second. The Mayan version of the sport, called pits, peaked in play around the years 250 to 900 AD. The sport itself was similar to that of modern volleyball. In the center of the arena, called the tlachtli, was a chalked line that divided the court in half. Although there were many variations of the sport, the most popular version required players to keep a ball in the air while passing it to the opposing team. A dense, heavy-ass, solid rubber ball that could weigh as much as 10 pounds.
Hey, do you have 10-pound balls?
Yeah. Why?
Well then how do you walk?
He freaking got you, dude. Before you even humor the thought of you slapping around a 10-pound solid sphere like you know you couldn't, players were forbidden from using their hands or feet to keep the ball in the air. Instead, hips, legs, chests, and booty cheeks were required to slam that thing around. If the ball made it across the line and the other team failed to keep it airborne, your team got a point. Despite using basic protection like hip guards and knee pads, the rubber ball itself was a force to be reckoned with. The sheer momentum behind the ball was enough for players to find themselves sustaining broken bones, being battered with bruises, and bleeding their own blood. Of course, the ball was not the only threat. While you were ducking and diving and dipping to prevent your opponent from scoring, you ran the risk of colliding with other players or slinging your skull into the solid stone walls that lined the arena. Colonial chronicler Diego Duran specifically noted the particularly brutal injuries sustained in this sport. He noted that players were horribly bruised across their bodies, with some players even dying from repeated blows to their tummies thanks to internal bleeding and organ damage. Now, if a player did manage to get the ball into one of those ornately decorated hoop holes, that player's team was instantly declared the winner, no matter the current score. But this was very rare, so much so that anyone who did it was legitimately revered for years after the fact, forever remembered as that one guy that put that ball through the hoop that one time. What a legacy. For the vast majority of the Mesoamerican societies across time, the sport was not only played for sport. In fact, there is a lot of historical evidence that points to societies like the Maya or the Mexica using the game for political means. As an example, Aztec Emperor Axayacatl wagered his riches against an opposing emperor's farmlands and lost. So there was also, of course, the gambling aspect of it. Spectators were known to risk all kinds of belongings, money, property, even their subjectively repugnant children. Outside of the degenerate lifestyle, there is a prevailing myth that losers were sacrificed for being losers. Yes and no. In the traditional version with two professional competing teams, this was never the case. They were simply professional ball players. Teams won and lost all the time. However, there is historical evidence in Aztec codices and Spanish documents that alluded to some societies forcing freshly enslaved prisoners of war to compete against a professional team. The slaves, of course, always lost, as the game was more of a symbolic and ceremonial kick in the dick. Those prisoners were then sacrificed shortly after, but they were already destined to have their chest cavities violently fisted anyway, not exclusively because they lost a simple ball game. Oh well, more blood for the sun god. Hey, it's your favorite live action chat history here, making a rare appearance to give you something nice to look at. Just kidding, using a single take and as little breaths as possible, I'm gonna tell you about today's sponsor, War Thunder. Here we go. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and you, yes, you can play it right now for free on your computer, Xbox, PlayStation, or even your phone. What do you do in War Thunder? Well, you hop onto about 2,500 different war machines of your choice. Drive tanks, fly planes, or sail ships, even though they have no sails. Most importantly, you can use your vehicle's arsenal to convert your enemies into a fine red mist. You can use little pea shooters from a 1920 biplane or fire a whole friggin' volley of weaponized tactiles from your very own warship. Whoa, neat. Thanks to all the details, realistic graphics, and authentic sounds, you'll get sucked right into the action. Want to take the upper management approach and just have fun without working too hard? Then the simple and clean arcade mode is right for you. But if you're looking to sauce up your little fingies, then the simulator mode has you pulling all the thick levers and tender knobs you could ever want. What I like is that War Thunder is heavily optimized, so even if you're stuck playing on grandpa's spare gambling computer, you can still trigger Pop-Pop's Vietnam flashbacks, even on the lower rigs. If that gets your juices flowing, then join the worldwide community of over 95 million players today. Use my stinky little links in the pinned comment and description below to download War Thunder for free. You'll even get the limited time goodies on PC and consoles, the Eagle of Valor decorator, 7 days of free premium access, and 100,000 silver lions to get you started. War Thunder, it's free, so play it. Now, if you're a greasy-blooded Italian like I know I'm not, you're probably very familiar with calcio storico. Despite having the ability to use more than just their piggies, calcio storico translates to historic football. In reality, it's like a combination of rugby, non-American football, and friggin' bare-knuckle boxing. That's because you're allowed to beat the ever-lovin' caca out of your opponents to win the game. A quick side note, why the heck do we not get this sport for the World Cup? Instead, we have to watch dudes kick a ball back and forth for nearly 2 hours while they over-dramatically fall to their knees in Walmart for catching a gentle breeze across their ankles? Pretty pathetic. Anyway, the rougher and tougher sport of calcio storico reportedly takes inspiration from the ancient ball-slapping Roman sport of harpastum, which itself was inspired from the ancient Greek sport of feninda. The earliest traces of calcio storico itself begins in the late 15th century as an unregulated and chaotic throwdown in the streets of Florence, Italy. This version is very similar to medieval mob football, which, as the name implies, pitted whole towns of medieval European peasants against each other in a muddy mashup as they wrestled around for the town ball. Calcio, however, was usually played during festivals or other communal events where many Florentines and Florin adults from differing neighborhoods would pinch together their fingers and initiate a challenge. An alternate origin story claims that the sport of calcio may have been used as a strength and agility training for young soldiers, but whether you were chilling in a town or killing for the crown, the game was played the same. The game was formally formalized by big bearded fajoule Giovanni de Bardi in 1580, transforming the commoner game into an aristocratic sport. He wrote the rules. 27 players on each team would be positioned within a field roughly 80 by 40 meters in size. For the Americans, that's about 80 by 40 meters in size. Oh yeah, and the whole field was covered in sand. Why sand? Well, besides being coarse and getting everywhere, sand is great for traction and absorbing energy when you fall to the ground. It's also great at soaking up the blood that will inevitably spill. Each team consisted of 15 forwards called corridori, which were your main fists on the field. There were also 5 scanciatori, or midfielders, 3 datori annanzi, which focused on possession progression, and finally 4 datori indietro. They were your goalkeepers. All you had to do was take the ball and get it in the opposing tent while defending your own. Oof, way too slow. Now you're down a few teeth, but you've got more. Now, before you try to signal the ref like a little bitch, what just happened to you was completely fair game. In their mission to score a goal, players were permitted to do anything and everything to chalk up one for the team. Punching, kicking, throwing, kissing, tackling, pinning down, all valid moves. Huh? What? No, I said kicking. The ball itself could be carried, passed, or kicked around the field. As a fun bonus, no substitutions were allowed. Every single player must fight through exhaustion and injury until the 50-minute game was over. Broken noses, busted eye sockets, shattered teeth, and racked ribs were very common. Now, of course, that's not to say that the sport was one big unregulated brawl. Each defensive or offensive maneuver needed purpose. You couldn't just walk up to Giuseppe and clock him in the jaw for no reason. Pizza pasta, think faster. The sport was the pride and joy of Florence for over 100 years before slowly fading into obscurity once the aristocracy focused on more artsy-fartsy forms of entertainment like opera and dancing. However, Calcio Storico was revived in 1930 and has since become an annual tradition, with the game being played within the heart of Florence, Italy, every single June. Seriously, why is this lukewarm brown bathwater version of this sport way more popular? It's just foul. Transitioning now from Greece to Greece, we have the downright brutal Panky-ration. What, you pronounced it pankration? You silly. This was an ancient unarmed all-out test of combative strength. That's because the name Panky-ration translates to all of power or almighty. Appropriately so, because competitors were giving it their all in the ways of beating the piss out of their opponents. Believed to have been invented by Greek demigod legends Heracles and Theseus as a means of defeating their enemies, Panky-ration was brought into the mainstream with its debut in the Greek Olympic Games in 648 BC. Many beefy bros fought tooth and nail in the games to prove themselves the superior warrior. The sport itself also yielded military benefits. Turns out that many ancient Greek soldiers would find themselves SOL if they were ever disarmed of their armaments. So being taught how to grapple and wrestle your enemy as a last resort would at least give you a literal fighting chance at survival. Panky-ration was most famously adapted by none other than those walking, bulging biceps known as the Spartans. They, of course, opted for the most brutal and violent form of the sport. You see, in the Olympic version, pretty much any maneuvers were allowed, save for two: biting and gouging. You were not allowed to sink your fangs into flesh, nor allowed to jam your thumbs into eye sockets. Yeah, the Spartans did not care about that. Their reasoning was that in do-or-die situations, you're gonna do whatever's necessary to not die. Buh. Ancient Greek writers, such as the famous Herodotus, documented the Spartans' remarkable abilities to thermop the floor with their enemies while being completely unarmed. Now, Panky-ration for sport rather than survival was a different matter. It was pretty much like mixed martial arts as we know it today, but with some slight differences. For instance, weight classes straight up didn't exist, so some 5'0" little chode could end up getting paired up against someone built like a brick shithouse. There were also no time limits. Matches continued on in perpetuity until someone formally surrendered or died. Thankfully, referees were on the sidelines to make sure that rules were being followed. If someone decided to cosplay as a pit bull and treat you like a tender newborn, the ref would jump in and give the violent violator a well-deserved whacking with a thin rod. Suffice to say that these fighters were no strangers to getting beaten within an inch of their lives. They would often find themselves held in full-on chokeholds or having their little fingers being bent backwards or broken. Ankles were forcibly twisted, tendons torn, elbows bent well beyond their normal range, and kneecaps gone obtuse. It was not pretty. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, to make the spectacle more spectacular, every participant had their dicks out. Yeah, the original Olympics were all done with dudes in the nude. Something about celebrating the human form or something? It's all well and good, but I'd be a tad hesitant to dangle my wangle out if some guy could potentially grab at my apples and provide me a textbook example of testicular torsion, which was a legal move, by the way. To no surprise, there's many well-documented instances of participants being sent across the river Styx as a direct result of the sport. Perhaps the most famous example was that of Arechion. Already a two-time Olympic Panky-ration champion in 564 BC, Ari was ready to go for gold a third time, but he ended up getting more than he bargained for. After squabbling with his opponent for some time, Ari found himself trapped in a seemingly fatal chokehold. Unable to escape, he began losing blood flow and started to go sleepy by. Right before slipping out of consciousness though, Arahion found a sudden, desperate surge of strength, managing to get a hold of his opponent's foot and popping that sucker from its socket. The sudden and indescribable pain instantly snapped his opponent out of his headlock maneuver, but in doing so, Arahion's neck was also snapped. Minus one ankle, the unknown opponent had formally surrendered as Ari's lifeless body flopped to the ground. He was dead, but that begs the question, did he win? You bet your olive-oiled balls he did. Despite being dead as a doornail, Olympic officials officially crowned a corpse as champion. Arahion had won his third and final Olympic crown. Now carved into legend, a marble statue of the naked champ was erected in his hometown. It's actually still on display today at the Museum of Olympic Games in Olympia. Ironically enough, without a head. Oh boy, back to the Italians. You know, there's probably a lot of people out there that believe the best way to get out their aggressions is through violence, and they're probably either in a cell or in the ground. But history has taught us that the most effective way of settling your differences was through an iconic alls-out, balls-out brawl. You see, the city of Venice experienced escalated gang violence between two factions dating as far back as the late 13th century. You had the rowdy Eastern Castellani clad in red, and the boisterous Western Nicolotti donning black. Both sides consisted mainly of burly laborers such as shipbuilders, fishermen, masons, and blacksmiths. You also had other low-income professionals looking to get some licks in, like artisans and even merchants of Venice. If you prick me, do I not bleed? The two clans would clash in random throwdowns throughout the city streets, causing property damage and inadvertently dragging innocent bystanders into their cartoon fighting clouds. Whoop! I need to be more careful. So in 1421, sick of all the stabbing and grabbing, city officials pushed the saucy little spaghettis to instead duke it out on various bridges throughout the city. This shrunk down the inevitable skirmishes to concentrated pockets instead of the entire city's streets. Bridges were in open areas and over water, so potential property damage was minimized. Thus, the Venetian Bridge Wars began. Well, that doesn't sound like much of a sport, you might say, flaring your hairy nostrils. I'm getting there. Relax. The earliest instances of the Venetian Bridge Wars were more or less actual wars. They were highly disorganized, unregulated, and excessively violent, as street brawls tend to be. There were no rules. Armored combatants could arm themselves with clubs, swords, spears, pretty much whatever you had to smack, prod, or whack with a rod. To no surprise, many people got killed, which in the eyes of the city officials was a huge no-no. Sure, you could punch someone's teeth down their throat, but you weren't allowed to punch them 6 feet under. But apparently, there was no real rush because it took nearly 180 years for the Venetian Bridge Wars to introduce rules and regulations to reduce the number of fatalities. That's reduce, not eliminate. Around the year 1600, the Venetian government banned any and all weaponry. Instead, if you wanted to dish out the pain, it would be with your own God-given damage dealers. Although it sometimes varied, a war would begin with a single champion from each side. They would go mano a mano as the crowds behind them eagerly awaited a victor. After a short scuffle, the opposing crowds collided like a wall of death at a Lamb of God concert. As for the rules, this was your basic game of King of the Hill. Fight back your opponents and establish territorial control. The game was over once one team had entirely forced the other side from the bridge. Since there were no walls or rails, combatants often found themselves flung into the waters below, but after a brief dip in the drink, assuming you were still conscious, it was time to get your slippery self out and back into the brawl. Your team needs you after all. Well, looks like you got clobbered by a roof tile, delivered first class to your ocular cavity from a nearby spectator. Yeah, this sport was one that tens of thousands flocked to see, surrounding the bridge high and low. After all, why get yourself into a rowdy rumble when you could just huck shit at people from a distance and face no real consequence? Cowards. Now, as for team sizes, they were whoever you could get to fight for you, so hundreds or even thousands of people could rush a single bridge in hopes of bringing glory to their side. But yeah, that glory came with a price. Fractured jaws, broken ribs, smashed skulls, inverted teeth, crushed limbs, all expected injuries from the fisting festivities. Despite the banning of weaponry, each event was still a healthy revenue bump for local undertakers. Venetian records detailed in Robert Davis's War of the Fists describe numerous deaths ranging from being crushed beneath the stampeding crowd to whacking one's noodle on the stone bridge as they fell, not to mention the inevitable drownings. So after centuries of what had become traditional acts of violence, the Venetian bridge wars finally took their toll. After a particularly savage scuffle on September 29, 1705, the High Council of Venice had called it quits, formally banning the wars and forcing the two sides to figure out some other way to vent their hatred towards each other. They would have loved Super Smash Bros. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring the video. Remember to use my links below to get in on the action today and also claim your free vehicle decorator, premium access, and 100,000 silver lions. Alright, roll the outro.